Okay, I'm Doug. I'm a wheelchair user living in a care home in Wetherby in North Yorkshire. I've been here about 20 years now. I've got unusual impairments. I've had a stroke. I've got autonomic problems, which means that I've got care needs and I'm a full-time wheelchair user. I don't know if I'm a crusader for disabled people's rights. I've got something in my brain that I don't like rules and procedures that aren't followed and that aren't enforced. And when I was reading about the Disability Discrimination Act back in about 2002, I was quite shocked at how much things weren't followed. The Disability Rights Commission produced a booklet which basically explains how to sue under the Disability Discrimination Act as a disabled litigant in person. So that means somebody without a solicitor or barrister just going through the court process on their own. And when the Disability Rights Commission felt that there wasn't a realistic prospect of success in the case against this particular marathon organizer, I went ahead and did it myself, and it was an interesting experience. I lost the case, but I learned a lot about how the process works, how it's supposed to work. And then the requirement to make adjustments to physical features came in. And I was going around my local town and other places and just seeing the degree of non-conformity with it. And I was like, what on earth is going on, you know? And leaving it to individual disabled people to enforce it fundamentally doesn't work. And that's why I think there's so much mass breaches, just because of there's something inside me that gets incredibly upset and angry and frustrated where disabled people are just routinely discriminated against and their rights are unenforced. I've started taking cases. I've honestly lost track now of the number of cases I've brought. The most famous one was with representation was First Bus, which was over the priority that wheelchair users or disabled people should have for the wheelchair space on buses, which was the first goods and services disability discrimination case to get to the Supreme Court, and which on paper we won, but in reality was more than a bit of a fudge. Yeah, I use law as a tool to get past the customer services people. It's only one extra tool, and it's not the answer, and it's fundamentally broken. You know, relying on us to try and bring cases is just ridiculous. Particularly when, you know, it's very difficult to get protection against costs, and there's a huge investment of time and energy and mental health in fighting through the courts. But it can be an effective tool, and it's sort of my niche. So back in, I think it was 2012, I went to catch a bus. I was going across to see my parents a part of the day. So I get there a few minutes beforehand, and I did this time, and there was like 2 people on the bus, 3 maybe. But there was a lady with a pushchair who'd got there before me and who had her pushchair in the wheelchair space. Driver turned around to her and said something without leaving the cab. The woman said something back. I wasn't entirely clear about it. I thought she'd said that her pushchair wouldn't fold. The driver later testified that she'd said, "Baby's asleep, I'm not going to wake him." And I believe the driver. Actually, my hearing's suspect, and he wasn't, you know, he was face to face with. So she just wouldn't move, which the driver was then like, "Sorry, you just can't get on." And I was like, "What?" This empty bus with a wheelchair space, and I'm not allowed to get on. So I asked if I could fold my wheelchair. It happened to be in a folding wheelchair, but he said no, because there would be nowhere safe to store the wheelchair, which I think on that kind of moment was a valid judgment for him to make. So I tried phoning West Yorkshire Metro, you know, the local public transport organisers, equivalent of TfL, I guess. And then I tried phoning the bus company. The bus company didn't respond. And, you know, I gave up. The bus left, and it was all very stressful and unpleasant. I was late for my parents, and then I couldn't face trying the same journey on the way back. So I got my dad to take me back, and I was put off public transport, particularly buses, for quite some time. I didn't catch any for about a year, just because this incident and other incidents had been so unpleasant and have fundamentally affected my confidence. And before this case, Chris Fry, campaigning solicitor, had contacted me because he'd seen some of the cases that I'd been taking through as a litigant in person. And at the time, he was the only, or amongst the only, solicitors that take disability discrimination goods, facilities and services cases, because there are so few in the country, cases that is. So he'd been looking for something to collaborate on. So when this happened, I got in touch with him and said, look, this looks like a decent case. And it was shocking as it happened. He agreed. He got barristers involved, and then he, as a private action, we took a case through the county court. We were very carefully, very quiet at the time, didn't do any press, any hint of it to anybody, because we wanted it to slip under the radar at First Bus. But we prepared a case very carefully and put in mountains of evidence. When I say we, this is really the hard work of the solicitors and barristers involved, particularly Kath Casserly. It went to court. They lost with quite an excellent judgment written by what they call the recorder. First Bus immediately sacked their entire legal team. Barristers and solicitors, which was quite entertaining. We went public, did a lot of media about it. First Bus employed a whole load of new solicitors and barristers and challenged the legal aid legal case, challenged our judgment, I think partly on the basis that it contrasted with another judgment up in the northeast, which was a group of disabled people taking a reaver to court for similar instances. Their judge found for the defendant, found for a reaver, so the claimants lost that case. So they did what's called a leapfrog, because it was obviously a point of contention and wider interest. It would normally have been appealed either within the county court system or to High Court. It didn't. It went straight up to the Court of Appeal in the Courts of Justice in London. The Equality and Human Rights Commission saw that it was a strategic case. We applied for what they call Section 28 assistance, which is basically money from them to pay for legal representation and indemnify against costs.
Appeal court found against you, did it?
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting because we've got lots of media and lots of supporters involved. I'm incredibly grateful to them. So sometimes I think that the court case and the results of it can be less influential or important than the public impact it has. You know, they found against us because I think they mischaracterized our case. Basically, our case was that more should be done to make it likely that people will shift. So it wasn't just about drivers ordering people to shift out of the space. Court of Appeal basically characterized it as, you know, the driver hasn't got the authority to insist people move. We immediately applied for permission to appeal to the Supreme Court, which was turned down by the Court of Appeal, but the Supreme Court themselves agreed yes. And then eventually the Supreme Court found in a favour. I mean, all the judges agreed that, you know, it's clear that First Bus could and should have done more. What they disagreed on was whether or not I should be given any damages. Because there were 7 justices, I think.
7 of them, right.
Usually there's 3, so they clearly recognised it was socially important. They all said that the bus company should do more. They recommended that the government change their legislation to make it clearer and to give the driver more powers. You know, back in the 1990s, people chained themselves, disabled people chained themselves to the underside of buses for the right to travel on a bus, you know, and that resulted in the bus structures being changed and the Disability Discrimination Act, which wasn't the piece of equality legislation people were looking for, but it's probably better than nothing. And it's all pointless in doing that if you don't have the right to travel and the ability to expect that you can turn up and use a bus unless there's already somebody in the wheelchair space, you know?
Right.
I think the Equality and Human Rights Commission should use their powers more.
Mm-hmm.
They have a range of different legal powers. They have had their resources stripped over the years, continually cut under austerity and before. But up until this last couple of years, they never used anything like the entirety of their budget anyway. They seem to have been dysfunctional, lacking in strategic thought. But fundamentally, they've got all of these, a whole swathe of different powers. I think the law should be changed. The ability to take class actions is not put in the law. So you can only bring an individual action. It feels a bit artificial sometimes. I had to hang that case basically about wheelchair users or disabled people's rights to use the wheelchair space on a bus off that one specific instance back in 2012, where I wasn't allowed on a bus, and you know, so it goes around the facts of that case where it's about an industry practice which is disadvantaging disabled people. It is so artificial, and leaving it to individual disabled people to take legal action to enforce it is broken. I think attitudes in society do need to change. In some respects, I think things have improved. But in other respects, the denigration of disabled people, the labeling, the terrible way in which disabled people are treated, particularly by the Department for Work and Pensions, but also disabled asylum seekers and so on, the labeling of benefit scroungers, Saints and Scroungers TV series, or all the other things, and the media portrayal has a massive impact on disabled people, and because it has a massive impact on the public perception of disabled people. And there's a rise of hate crime, and the United Nations has found clear and convincing evidence that there's grave and systematic abuse of disabled people by the government, and yet nothing significant has changed as a result of that. They found that twice under the Committee of Rights of a Person with Disabilities, and it's just really, really shocking. So on the face of it, it might look like there's better access. You know, you see symbols saying wheelchair access this way, but the reality of disabled people's daily experience, not just in kind of daily day-to-day interface with services, but also in terms of housing and so many other ways, social care, the approach to disabled people, I think, is getting worse, and that is intentional by the government. But it became particularly apparent during coronavirus when it became clear that disabled people, you know, lots of people say, well, the Equality Act's been suspended, we don't have to make reasonable adjustments, you know, it's a national emergency. So these obligations are more important now than they ever were. You know, we're having care homes written to saying, don't expect your residents to have access to hospital or critical care. You know, you should discuss do not resuscitate orders now. And the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, NICE, came up with guidelines saying much the same. And NHS and the BMA, British Medical Association, and lots of other people. You know, it's just really apparent that the government and the public feeling is that a substantial proportion of the public is that disabled people's lives just aren't worth the same as non-disabled, and that's just become incredibly clear. I think part of the answer is the amazing action done by deaf and disabled people's organisations. There's been a lot of challenge which has forced the government to realise to a certain extent that, you know, they can't just ride over human rights, or they can't ride over the Equality Act effectively. I think the answer is to you know, work with each other and be public and challenge things, as happens. It's not easy.